Why did you decide to do your own show and become a TV host?
Well, there's two reasons. First of all, being under house arrest for so long, it's nice to have an occasional visitor and to learn more about the world. And given that the conversations we were having are quite interesting, why not film it and show other people what was going on? So that's one reason. The second reason is that as someone who's given a lot of interviews before, and it's been on the receiving end of very aggressive interview styles, I found that I wasn't giving much away in these interviews at all. That pretty quickly you learn to just give your sort of standard defensive responses, so people don't take what you've said out of context. And I want to have a different sort of approach with other people. And why that approach has been difficult in some ways, I think it has also succeeded in other ways, in that we've revealed sides of very interesting and important people that are not normally revealed because they're not dealing with a standard interviewer. They're dealing with someone who's under house arrest, who has gone through political problems that they can sympathise with.
And how easy did you find it moving sort of from one side of the desk to the other, becoming the interviewer?
It was a lot harder than I thought it was. In the beginning, very hard. As time went by, like everything, you start getting better at it. The constraints of the medium, the constraints of time, the constraints of cameras, the constraints of people crowding the intimate space that an interview occurs in, really does funnel the types of conversations that can occur into a particular direction. So you'll see, for example, when we do a satellite feed and we've only got 45 minutes, actually the interaction, and it's going through translation, the interaction is much more similar to a conventional interview, where we have the sort of luxury of 3 hours and having people here personally. It moves much more to a sort of conversation. So I have more sympathy with these people who are interviewing me as well, understanding that the constraints of the medium are one of the pernicious factors. But they're not the only pernicious factor. There's also the constraints of the organisation behind the medium.
So how did you get to know RT, and why did you choose RT for the broadcast of your first programme?
We've seen RT's reportage on the attacks on WikiLeaks for a number of years, and that reportage has generally been quite supportive. When we were looking what international broadcaster we wished to partner with as opposed to national broadcasters, we looked to see what was the penetration into the United States. And RT had higher penetration in the United States than Al Jazeera. BBC is the leading contestant, but the BBC has been acting in a hostile manner towards us, so we didn't consider that the BBC would be an appropriate partner.
RT aims to provide this kind of alternative view to those aired by the international mainstream channels. Is your choice of RT as a platform for your interview show your kind of response to that mainstream media?
Well, it is a response in seeing that a lot of the things that we have been trying to report have not been carried accurately in the mainstream press. Now, there are many, many fine exceptions, but when we look at international networks, there's really only two that are worth speaking about, and that is RT and Al Jazeera. The other international networks are, as far as WikiLeaks issues are concerned, are too busy considering their own national agenda. Now, if WikiLeaks had been producing a voluminous material about Russia, perhaps that situation would be different. But in the case that we are in at the moment, where our major confrontation is with the West, although we have published material from many countries, RT is a natural partner to produce our material. Also the same with Al Jazeera, but RT has had greater penetration into the United States.
And why is it that WikiLeaks hasn't been producing reams of information about Russia?
Well, we have actually produced a lot of information about Russia, but from sources that were not Russia. For example, in the US diplomatic cables, lots of material came out about Russian corruption. It came out from the US perspective on what Russian corruption was. Earlier on, we have done material from Russia and quite a bit more material from China. I've often wondered why we've just never received that much material from Russia. And I think it is mainly due to, well, the website's not in Russian, it's in English. But also the Russian internet sector, the Russian internet community is very vibrant. And so you see these things being discussed in the Russian internet community, And to that degree, there's not such a need for WikiLeaks because there are Russian leaking sites and vibrant Russian blogs.
The show's going to be launched on RT, but have you received offers from other channels? Has anyone else approached you with purchase offers?
Yes, we received offers from other channels, and we are sub-licensing the show to other national broadcasters. RT is our international broadcaster in the sense that CNN or Al Jazeera or the BBC is the international broadcaster.
You've worked closely with what we called the mainstream media in the past. What did that teach you about them?
Any organisation, once it grows to a sufficient size and has sufficient influence, starts having to make political compromises. And media organisations, by their very nature, engage in the political sphere. So the editors and publishers of media organisations have to sit down at the table with powerful groups. And they start becoming captured by those powerful groups. And so we have found that in working with them, when we're trying to get out our material through organisations, say, such as The Guardian or the New York Times or the BBC, that these organisations self-censor in a tremendously frequent manner. And in a way which is against their stated values. It's not just against our values, it's against their stated values, and in some cases even against the contracts that we have made with those organisations.
You mentioned several specific publications and channels there. What response do you expect from the international mass media, some of whom you've already fallen out with, right? Do you expect a level of criticism, and if so, why?
Of course. I mean, those organisations like the New York Times that we have refused to work with based upon what they were doing back in 2010. Although we do work with individual journalists at the New York Times and individual journalists in other institutions that we've found problems with. I assume that that they will attack. I mean, just like they do when any competing media organisation releases a big story, they always write against the story.
What sort of form do you expect that criticism to take? Let's
imagine the sort of obvious one. There's Julian Assange, an enemy combatant, a traitor, getting into bed with the Kremlin and interviewing terrible radicals from around the world. But I think that's it's a pretty trivial kind of attack on character. If they actually look at how the show is made, we make it, we have complete editorial control. We believe that all media organisations have an angle, all media organisations have an issue. RT is a voice of Russia, so it looks at things from a Russian agenda. The BBC is a voice of the British government. The Voice of America is a voice of the American government. And it is the clashing of these voices together that reveals the truth about the world as a whole. Our issue at the moment is that we are in a legal confrontation with the Department of Justice in the United States as a result of our recent publications, which concern the United States. So it's very natural in order for us to speak about the way we see the world and interesting figures in the world, we need to partner with organisations that are actually capable of speaking. And unfortunately, the majority of the big networks in the United States are now not capable of effectively criticising US military power or the abuse of US military power.
Were you restrained by editorial policies while you were making the programme for RT?
No, not at all. We make the programme, it is made an independent British production company, and the international broadcaster we've chosen is RT. So at no stage has any editorial control been exercised, and no stage was it capable of being exercised by RT.
And have you found that to be true?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there has been no interference in the show at all.
What are the terms and details of your contract with RT?
So we are obligated to provide an intro, the show and the credits, and that's it.
Are you concerned over criticism of the fact that your show is being launched by RT?
We are always concerned about spin attacks and smear campaigns because actually they're effective. I mean, we are an organisation that lives in the cut and thrust of international political debate, and people are always trying to shift the perceptions one way or another. So we have to fight attempted smears with facts. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work.
Alexander Lebedev, the owner of The Independent and The Evening Standard, said it's hard to imagine a more miserable finale for a world order challenger than an employee of state-controlled Russia today. What's your response to criticism like that?
Well, this is Alexander Lebedev, actually. We partnered with Lebedev's newspaper in Moscow, Novoye Gazeta, and The Independent in London. But, you know, despite that, when Lebedev's Ukrainian banks were raided, he said that his Ukrainian banks were raided in Ukraine not as a result of tax evasion, but because he had partnered with WikiLeaks. And we know that's not true because it was only 2 days later. So Lebedev engages in his own sort of, you know, he's an interesting political business figure, and he engages in his own tactical considerations about who he's saying is in and who he's saying is out.
When you were choosing the guests, what were your criteria?
The single biggest criteria is that they would come on the show. Now that's quite interesting because there are a number of guests that we couldn't get, and so let's talk about that sort of hidden censorship. So we're still trying, but Al Weiwei, who's currently imprisoned under house arrest in China, he views that his political situation makes it extremely difficult for him to speak to the media at all. Khodorkovsky, in a prison in Russia, was a billionaire oligarch who's being imprisoned. So we would like to speak to him. We can't. He's in prison. Then if we look at some of the big US insiders, so people that who are the tops of power of some giant US corporations, that we have indirect personal contact with. So some of them say, no, it's too dangerous as far as the US government is concerned. Yes, I would love to help you. Yes, I'd like to do the show, but politically it's just too dangerous. So then we go to the other groups that we have chosen, and we did actually get most of those. So those are people who normally don't get a voice.
Could any of the guests that you have got, do you think, appear on a mainstream TV network?
Some could, some couldn't. Some have, quite a few haven't. What is fair to say is that the majority of what they have said to me, they could not say on a mainstream TV network. That is not just because of self-censorship of the networks. It's because my style of interaction, as someone who has been interviewed by the media many, many times, I understand the faults in that format. And so I wanted something that looked at the sort of the depth in the situations that they had. So a way of pulling out their story about their situation from their own perspective, and not just something that would fit a media soundbite. And in dealing with me, they understand that they're not just dealing with a host, they're not just dealing with a reporter. They're dealing with someone who's been through a very trying, dangerous and difficult political situation. So they can speak to a degree as equals because they understand that I understand. For example, most of the guests that I interviewed have been in prison at some stage. I've been in prison. So immediately there's a sort of rapport that is present that is not present in a regular interview.
Would you invite anyone from Russia's political opposition to be on your programme? And if so, who do you think it might be?
Yes, we've invited a number of people from Russia's political opposition. The Russian election cycle interfered with that because of their schedule and availability, but we'll see if they'll turn up. But we've invited nearly all the prominent figures. And we've invited people from the Russian government as well to try and get some balance.
Are you going to use any new WikiLeaks data for this project?
We have actually used it for some of the questions for some people. But it is not, in general, you know, we're not using this show to present new WikiLeaks data, but for occasional guests, the information that we have is quite interesting.
And are any of your guests sort of directly linked to WikiLeaks information?
Oh yes, yes. There's nearly all the guests are in our information in one way or another.
To what extent did the restricting of your freedom of movement kind of interfere in the making of the programmes?
Well, the restriction of my freedom of movement is what caused the programmes. You know, now I have been over 460 days detained without charge, and I was used to going around the world from place to place where the greatest political dynamics were, where we could be of most assistance. And so it's quite isolating to be frank, to be stuck out in the English countryside under those conditions. So this all began as a way of bringing people to me so we could understand what was actually happening in the world, because we need to understand, as part of running WikiLeaks, what is actually happening.
You made a speech at the Occupy camp in London. What do you think about the Occupy movement as a whole? Do you see them as your supporters?
They have been very supportive all over the world. I mean, and that support has been on the surface as well as under the surface. In Occupy New York, the WikiLeaks truck was there on day one, and we even had a film crew there on day one. So this connection this connection between us and Occupy has been there since the beginning in one way or another. When we did the Occupy episode, we looked at why is it? Because it's from our perspective, it's not like we planned the Occupy movement. Rather, it was that a lot of our supporters somehow became also involved with Occupy. For example, one of the principals of the London Occupy movement, although she wouldn't describe herself like that, is Naomi, who's in the Occupy episode. And she also happened to be the head of the Bradley Manning campaign in London, just by coincidence.
How afraid are you that if you are extradited to Sweden, you'll be moved on pretty quickly from there to the US?
Well, afraid is probably not the best word to use. I mean, we have certain legal attacks, we have certain political attacks, and we also adapt to those attacks. So our researchers and our legal team have been looking at what is the reality with the US situation. And the reality is that there has been a secret grand jury going in Washington, not very secret anymore because subpoenas and so on have come out of it, trying to indict me for espionage. And then in our recent Stratfor release, we found, in fact, that a former agent of the Bureau of Diplomatic Security Service within the State Department was sending around notification that there had, in fact, been an indictment and that everyone should keep this quiet. Similarly, diplomatic cables sent from Washington to Australia state that the investigation into WikiLeaks by the US government was of unprecedented scale and nature, and the one into me personally was active and vigorous. And there's been, there's a big paper trail now between the US and Australia and within the US in this investigation. Back in December 2010, The Independent ran a piece about how the US was already in informal talks with Sweden about my onwards extradition. Now, that is not to say that Sweden is the only danger, far from it. Every day that I sit here under house arrest, we run the risk that the US will simply give up on waiting for Sweden and will just extradite directly from the United Kingdom. And the laws for extradition in the United Kingdom are also quite bad. The laws in Australia are now also quite bad. Those were changed just 2 weeks ago in Australia, making it very easy to extradite Australian citizens for political offences and even offences for less than 12 months imprisonment.
The UN Special Rapporteur has said that the American treatment of Bradley Manning has verged on the torturous, basically, cruel, inhuman, degrading. Are you afraid of torture if you're extradited to the US?
The UN Special Rapporteur has found that the US treatment of Bradley Manning was cruel, unusual and degrading. That is his finding. And that it could also be torturous, but he was blocked from speaking to Bradley Manning in private. Unlike all the other sort of interactions that they are meant to have. The US has agreed as part of a treaty that UN Special Rapporteurs can speak to prisoners in private. That has been prevented in Bradley Manning's case. He has been detained without trial for 667 days now. So yes, we're concerned. I mean, Bradley Manning's lawyer says the reason that he is being treated this way is in order to squeeze him to make a false confession about me. So that treatment of him is a lever to try and get me and get the organisation.
Do you feel responsible for that?
Well, to the degree that WikiLeaks is a publishing organisation and we are tasked to publish secrets that reveal various forms of abuse, and we did so in this case, and they've grabbed this young man and put him in prison. Perhaps not responsible for it, but we in part, have a duty of care as to the situation, because whether he is a source or he is not a source, he is a young man that is wrapped up in our work in some manner.
Julian Assange, thank you very much.
Thank you. We looked to see what was the penetration into the United States. And RT had higher penetration in the United States than Al Jazeera. BBC is the leading contestant, but the BBC has been acting in a hostile manner towards us, so we didn't consider that the BBC would be an appropriate partner.
RT aims to provide this kind of alternative view to those aired by the international mainstream channels. Is your choice of RT as the platform for your interview show your kind of response to that mainstream media?
Well, it is a response in seeing that a lot of the things that we have been trying to report, defensive responses, so people don't take what you've said out of context. And I want to have a different sort of approach with other people. And why that approach has been difficult in some ways, I think it has also succeeded in other ways, in that we've revealed sides of very interesting and important people that are not normally revealed, because they're not dealing with a standard interviewer. They're dealing with someone who's under house arrest, who has gone through political problems that they can sympathise with.
And how easy did you find it moving sort of from one side of the desk to the other, becoming the interviewer?
It was a lot harder than I thought it was. In the beginning, very hard. As time went by, like everything, you start getting better at it. The constraints of the medium, the constraints of time, the constraints of cameras, the constraints of people crowding the intimate space that an interview occurs in, really does funnel the types of conversations that can occur into a particular direction. So you'll see, for example, when we do a satellite feed and we've only got 45 minutes, actually the interaction, and it's going through translation, the interaction is much more similar to a conventional interview, where we have the sort of luxury of 3 hours and having people here. Personally, it moves much more to a sort of conversation.
Why did you decide to do your own show and become a TV host?
Well, there's two reasons. First of all, being under house arrest for so long, it's nice to have an occasional visitor and to learn more about the world. And given that the conversations we were having are quite interesting, why not film it and show other people what was going on? So that's one reason. The second reason is that as someone who's given a lot of interviews before, and it's been on the receiving end of very aggressive interview styles, I found that I wasn't giving much away in these interviews at all. That pretty quickly you learn to just give your sort of standardization. So I have more sympathy with these people who are interviewing me as well, understanding that the constraints of the medium are one of the pernicious factors. But they're not the only pernicious factor. There's also the constraints of the organisation behind the medium.
So how did you get to know RT, and why did you choose RT for the broadcast of your first programme?
We've seen RT's reportage on the attacks on WikiLeaks for a number of years, and that reportage has generally been quite supportive. When we were looking what international broadcaster we wished to partner with as opposed to national broadcasters,